Welcome to Simple Robotics, the podcast, a podcast exploring the animation industry one episode at a time. I'm your host, Monique, and you can find me on all social media platforms at Simple Robotics, SIMPLYROBOTIX. And remember, when listening to the show, commenting, posting, sharing on social media, use the hashtag Simple Robotics Pod to join in on the conversation.
So, yes, welcome everybody. Thank you. I'm so happy to I'm not happy. I am mixed feelings, not mixed feelings. I'm happy to say that this again is another sponsored Autodesk episode. I am sad because at least as much as I know in this moment that we're recording, this is my last sponsored episode, at least of the season. And I thought, who could I get that's also very interesting? Like, I've been having a whole bunch of interesting people, and I was just on Twitter, and I was like, of course, Raqi. And the way you pronounced your name before we started recording was quite interesting because I don't think I'm saying it properly. Maybe I'm saying it good enough. But can you introduce yourself to my listeners and my viewers, please?
I can. Hi, Monique. I am Raqi Syed. My name is easier to pronounce than it looks. The Q without the U is not done in English. That's why it's confusing. Raqi. Shall I give you a backstory, like a bio?
Yeah, so just to start from, where are you from and where are you based currently?
So I was born in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but I grew up in Southern California, and I now live in Wellington, New Zealand. So my heart is always in LA, but my physical body is here in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
And before we get into it, what was the transition like for you being in the States and then moving to a whole nother country?
Yeah, it was pretty crazy because I came to New Zealand in 2008 and I only came for 1 year. I had a 1-year contract at Weta Digital, and I thought, I wanted to change. I always wanted to come to New Zealand because they had made the Lord of the Rings films, and it was very exciting. When I was a student, the idea that you could go to New Zealand and work in visual effects at a company like Weta Digital. And so New Zealand is interesting because it's like a very slow sort of culture shock. You get here, everyone speaks English. It feels very familiar, but then you start to realize as an American that there's this really huge cultural gulf between our sense of popular culture and the way that we exist, the way that our values, how we interact with each other, and that of the Commonwealth, which is kind of the British system, which New Zealand is a former colony, so comes out of that. And so the culture shock was slow, but it did come eventually. Okay. But yeah.
In what industry are you currently working in?
So I still consider myself at heart a visual effects artist because, I started as a, I can talk a little bit more about this later, but I've always wanted to work in animation. Like, I've always known that animation is my medium, and there's a lot of crossover between animation and visual effects. There's a lot of convergence that's happened, but that is sort of my bread and butter in terms of my skills and the way that I think, because I have a very film-oriented way of thinking. But I do work in virtual reality now. I've made a virtual reality experience, and I teach visual effects to students. But again, it's very much like this convergence of thinking about the medium as a way to tell stories. Not just traditionally in film, but also for real-time technologies like games and immersive and all that stuff. And I teach. I'm a researcher at Victoria University of Wellington.
And did you go to any sort of art school or trade school for VFX and virtual reality stuff? And what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I did go to art school. I didn't go to a trade school. Sometimes I wish I had, because I would have had more hardcore skills out of the gate. But I learned how to animate, I guess you could say, because I started making animated films when I was in junior high, and then I did that all through high school, stop motion specifically. And then I went to film school and I got like a proper film degree in film theory and film history at the University of Southern California. And then I did an MFA in animation and digital arts. So that was an art degree, but again, in the context of film school.
And so I always like to ask my guests too, just because I think it's important that the career journey is just not always linear. Like some people think you go to college and then your first job is like an intern somewhere and then boom, you're working on like, you know, these blockbuster movies. But what was like your first job ever versus your first job in the industry?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna I did have a fairly linear trajectory, and it was weird because I started early. And so my first job was in the film industry, but it wasn't a very exciting job. I worked at a
Okay.
studio called Stan Winston Digital, which had an amazing history. So that's where Stan Winston, the amazing special effects artist, ran his studio, and they worked on the original Terminator, and they made creature effects, like physical creature effects. And
Yeah, the practical
in the
stuff.
early, yeah, practical stuff. In the early 2000s, they started moving into the digital space, and they worked on a film called Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, which I don't know if you remember, but it was one of the early films that really combined digital world building with live action. And I was like the bottom of the barrel. Like I showed up there and they were like, do you want to man the render queue? And it was just like back burner and like literally moving renders around. It wasn't very exciting. And then they were like, hey, do you want to build some desks? And so I was kind of like a production assistant. And I remember feeling really demoralized because the studio was in the valley and my family lived at that time in San Bernardino. For anyone who understands the geography of LA, you had to drive through 2 counties to get to Stan Winston Digital Studios. And of course, I couldn't afford to live on my own. So I had this like 90-minute commute. I spent 3 hours of every day sitting in traffic. And I was like, why did I go to film school?
Oh.
What am I doing with my life? It was, yeah. And that only actually lasted 6 months, although it felt like an eternity. But that was
Oh,
my
well,
first job.
that's impressive. My first industry job, I was a runner, and I the day that I quit, it was because they had like asked me multiple times to scrub the walls because there was like
Yeah.
guck on it with the magic eraser, and I was just like, you know what? I think today's gonna be my last day. And that was like after like 3, almost 4 months. I was like, I cannot do this anymore. So you know, some people are able to actually go through with that for extended periods of time, and you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
I wasn't
I
one of
had
those
this
people.
weird I had this weird combination of not having a lot of confidence, but then also maybe a secretly self-inflated ego, knowing that like I can do better than this.
Yeah, I relate to that a lot. So in reading a bit about you, I learned that you worked on Meet the Robinsons and Tangled. So where did that come in your career journey, and what was it like being at a studio like Disney?
Yeah. So after Stan Winston, I did a couple of very short jobs. One of them was working at a studio called Escape, which is what the studio that worked on the original Matrix films was called Mannix. And there's a whole history there, which I won't go into, but that shut down and they escaped to the other side of the campus where Maddox was located, and they started Escape, and they worked on the second two Matrix films there. So I got hired as a junior lighter to work on a film called Catwoman with Halle Berry
Oh,
as
okay.
Catwoman.
Yes.
Yeah. So I worked on that for a few months, and that was cool because it was like really amazing people. It was this studio that had this amazing short history of working on basically the coolest film, visual effects film of the period, which was The Matrix. And I was doing stuff that was related to lighting and rendering, even though I was just a junior artist. I was supporting the lighters. Um, And that was really cool because they also told us that in the group of junior TDs that we're going to work on Superman and a bunch of other films, and we want to hire you and keep you on. And then, of course, stuff happened and they lost all their funding.
Oh no.
The film fell through. And so left after Catwoman. And Catwoman had the distinction of being the worst film of the year. Like, it swept at the Razzies.
Yeah.
I actually think Halle Berry won an Academy Award for Monster Ball.
Yeah.
And an award at the Razzies in the same year. So she's
God.
amazing.
Yeah. I've actually still never seen that Catwoman just because I've heard such not great things about it.
Yeah, no, it's not the best, but it has a very special place in my heart because I feel like it gave me the opportunity to like advance, like to go from someone who was doing weird PA type stuff to actually getting the title of junior lighting PD.
Right.
And then I was able to leverage that into being interviewed by the folks at Disney Feature Animation for an ATD position on, it was actually like they were just finishing up Chicken Little. So I did a tiny bit of stuff on Chicken Little, but mainly I was there to work on Meet the Robinsons. And that was the time when Disney was transitioning from being a 2D studio. They had shut down their Florida operation and they were wanting to reinvent themselves as like a studio that does what they do, but in making CG films. So it was kind of cool because it was like you got everything that you expected from the Disney experience, which was the legacy, the support, the, you know, just the amazing feeling of walking into a studio like that. But then it had this startup culture because they were trying to figure out something for the first time for them. And so a lot of people were having, like, they had this kind of experimental approach to building the pipeline. And it was a really fun time. Like, there was a whole group of ATDs that I came in with. I still know a bunch of them. We've worked together over the years. So I feel like that was my real first job and really set me up for understanding, like, what does it mean to be a technical director, work in CG, support this storytelling process, and also about professionalism and all that stuff.
Yeah, and you're using words like the lighting artist and TD. Can you just explain a little bit to my listeners what that actually means? I don't think we've had someone with your background on yet.
Yeah, so TD means technical director, and this is kind of, I heard someone describe it recently as the Swiss Army knife of computer graphics production. And it kind of is, in that, like, you're meant to be someone who understands the tools and can work, who knows what they're doing in any particular discipline conceptually and can quickly pick up the technology to support that. So in the lighting context, it's like knowing how to light, knowing how to debug, knowing how to tell stories visually through light, but then also having to do stuff like read render logs, figure out why renders are taking a long time, optimize renders, write scripts to support the the artists to do things quickly, to fix, prevent them from having to do repetitive tasks. So it's a technical role that supports artistry. And in animation, it usually means like you're quite a technical person. And then they have a separate role for the lighting artist. And that's the person that just uses the tools to mainly do art stuff, like setting up lights and things like that. And you have these two people work together, like the technical person supports the artistic person. And that's how it's been traditionally in feature animation. But in visual effects, they don't separate those roles. They just have them be one person. So when I went to Weta Digital, I was expected to be a TD for sure, but then they're like, but you also just know how to light, right? And I was like, yeah, definitely. Like, then I had to very quickly learn, like, what does it mean to be both of these roles? And I just think, like, the best people working in computer graphics usually have some combination of these two skill sets, which is technical and artistic. Yeah. And the ATD is the entry level version of that. So it's a assistant technical director. And what you're doing there is you're usually learning about the pipeline and doing stuff like you come in the morning, renders have errored overnight, you read through the logs, you figure out why, you go and you feed that information to the right people, or you're writing scripts and setting up automated processes. You're like helping to do very small tasks to support the larger process of filmmaking in the studio.
That's cool because I know often people might be like, well, I can't draw or I don't know how to animate or maybe they're not so artsy, but they still would want to be a part of the animation industry in some capacity. So basically, maybe if you have some sort of like computer science background or IT or something, you can probably still work your way into like a technical director type of position, right? Would you say? But you still would need to
Yeah.
learn some art stuff still because of whichever department you're working with, but you can be more technical than be more artsy, but still a part of the process.
Yeah, and most people tend to have a strength in one area or the other. Like some people are amazing artists and they just have like the best eye and they just know where to put lights and how to make the image look good. And other people are super technical and can solve problems and work very efficiently. In my time when I first entered the industry, you saw a lot of people who came from architecture because they knew how to like build worlds and think in 3 dimensions. You also had a lot of people coming from computer science, and that's still the case, engineering. But then, like, there's this art school breed. Like, someone like me, when I went to USC, they were like, well, here's Maya, and here's RenderMan, and here's all the tools, but we're not here to teach you how to use them. We have some expertise, and you put it all together. And I was sitting next to people that were doing hand-drawn animation. And the idea was that we're just all using the tools that we need to explore the art of animation. I just think proficiency of like the ability to work in 3D is the thing that I evaluate for when students come to my program. And I think that if you understand spatial thinking, then you can probably do fine working in computer graphics.
Okay. Now I want to get back to your career journey a bit. And so you get to work on movies like Catwoman and some other more practical effects and stuff like that. You have a bit of that experience. Then you find yourself at Disney for a bit, and then you transition back. And you say that you worked on films like Avatar, Planet of the Apes, and the Hobbit Trilogy. What was it like bouncing from, the whole Disney atmosphere and more cartoony animated stuff to going back to such VFX heavy films and projects?
Yeah, well, so it was when I went to Weta Digital that I got serious about like thinking like a photographer because that's what you had to do as a lighter or someone who worked in a shots context at that time. And there's like this amazing sort of culture of people at Weta that enjoyed doing photography as a hobby, and that understanding of like exposure, f-stop, aperture, like all the things that help you like make a good image using photography, whether it's digital or film based, are the kinds of skills that you need to understand how to make the image look good in visual effects. And so like this idea of like PBR, physically based rendering, what is reality, what is realism, and then how do we marry those two things, right? So like what I hadn't really done in any of my junior roles before I started at Disney, and of course didn't do at Disney, was this idea that you have a live action image we call plate, and then you have some element like something as simple as like a flying car or a flying manhole cover or like a part of the street that gets ripped up, anything like that that has to be put into that element, into that plate, and it has to look like it all sits in one world. And that's the difference, I think, with visual effects, is that you're trying to make a CG asset or element look like it belongs in a live action world. And that's what I started to develop my eye for, when I came to Weta.
Did you have any, or what were some challenges that you faced and overcame while working on these kind of projects at Weta?
Well, the time frames were really condensed compared to what I was used to in feature animation at that time. So like, Disney used to spend like they would have films that were in production or in development for 10 years. And then
Right.
we had like 2-year production cycles. So you would work on a feature film for 2 years if you were a person that rolled on at the beginning till the end. And Avatar was definitely one of these films. Like the story is that it had been in pre-production for 10 years, and then we spend a couple of years working on it. But other than that, most of the shows were smaller. Like they were like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. And so you had to work quickly. The timelines were much more condensed, and you're not your own client. Like that was the other big difference, is that Disney, everything is happening in-house. So like the person that you're there to, the director is also in-house. So everyone's working together as a team. It's kind of a different culture. Whereas when you're at a visual effects studio and you're a client, you just have to deliver a vision and try not to intervene in what that vision is that's given by the director who's outside the studio. And so it's much more of a service context, and you do have to work a little bit faster.
And I mean, was it just a matter of just stepping up to the plate and doing it? Did you have much adjusting in that? Or it was like, yeah, you just had to do it?
Yeah, you just have to do it. But also, like, when I got there, I was given the title of lighting TD, but I was still like kind of transitioning from a junior to a lighting TD, like a junior to mid career. I was sort of in that in between space. And I was given shots where I was doing these like background elements or integrating environment elements into a shot. And then the idea was that like once you advance, like if you're like the thing that everybody wants to do in lighting and visual effects, light creatures and characters and do those hero beauty shots. And so for me, it was like working up to having the skill and the eye to be able to do that, and to kind of like ingratiate myself to the masters and like learn from them and figure out like what are we doing when we're lighting characters. And so I think that was really my journey in visual effects while working at Weta, is understanding how you light characters, and what that's like, what the storytelling then conceptual skills are behind that.
And do you still like react, or are you over seeing your name and credits for these movies?
I haven't seen my name in credits for a few years because I haven't really worked on a feature film since the last Hobbit.
Okay.
Yeah, I did get over that a little bit, just because it's special, and I think that there's the thing that I do miss is that feeling of it's like you're like the team, the camaraderie, that you're doing something together, and that you have this like really large goal, and then it all comes to fruition, and the culmination of it is that you go to a screening together and you have that shared experience. And then you get all this street cred too, right? Like, oh, I worked on Avatar, I worked on like these cultural touchstones, and there's something fun and cool about that. But it's like after a while I became a little weary of it too. Like, it's fine. It's there's a whole other aspect to it that there's the burnout factor as well. So
no, I'm sure.
I share like the enthusiasm that people that work in the industry have for that, and their commitment to craft. Like, I understand why it's super exciting, but I don't feel the need for it anymore. Like, I think I get more pleasure out of doing things that are actually telling my own story, even if they're at a smaller scale. And so that's what I'm focused on now.
We're definitely going to get into that a bit more soon too. What made you get into teaching?
I guess when I went to school, I had so much respect for my teachers. Like, at least the teachers at USC, they were really amazing. And in the animation department, they all came from like Cal Arts, and so a lot of them had studied at Cal Arts and led departments there, and they formed the animation program at USC as like an extension of what they had experienced, but then also a response, like ideologically what they wanted to do. So like at Cal Arts, the animation program, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's broken up into 2 tracks. It's like there's character-based animation, and then there's experimental, and they're totally 2 separate things. And the people who started the USC program, like Christine Panushka, they really wanted these things to be together, integrated. So regardless of your focus, you're working alongside people that are doing character or experimental. It's all one thing to them. And I think that that was like really forward thinking, because that's where we're at right now in terms of
Yeah.
like animation is being used to do everything, and you kind of see experimental techniques happening in a commercial context all the time now. Like if you look
Yep.
at what's happening with animation on Netflix and Amazon and stuff. So that was cool, and I really appreciated that. And as I've gotten older, I've appreciated the wisdom in that kind of approach to teaching. And so when I left visual effects, I thought I'm just going to go and see if I could teach like an adjunct and teach one class and see how I like it. And then it turned into a full-time job. But
And how many
yeah,
years have you been teaching now?
so I'm in my 5th year, and I guess the timing was good because like I came to Victoria and they hired me because they said, oh, we have these visual effects classes that we want to start teaching. And then it turned out they had a program that they had created, and they needed to staff that. So I then went into the role of being the program director for that particular program, which is a graduate curriculum around visual effects.
Cool. Cool. So you also mentioned, to me that it's important for the industry to focus on developing, as you put it, anti-racial critical aesthetics of visual effects. And I was wondering if you could just break that down for me.
Yeah, an anti-racist critical aesthetics. And I guess like, in the last few years, particularly after the murder of George Floyd, one of the things that I found myself thinking is like people are doing so much amazing activism, and what can I do? What is my role to play? Like what skills do I actually have? And I felt like I needed to turn inward and say, okay, I'm a filmmaker. I understand visual effects. Is there work to be done in terms of like anti-racism in visual effects? Absolutely. And we can look at the technology. It's not just the kinds of stories, because there's a lot of discussion around diversity, inclusion, and equity in like who's telling the stories, who's writing the stories, what kind of stories and characters we're seeing, both in live action and in animation. But in visual effects, there's all these technologies like skin shading and hair shading. So what I found when I started working with some of the off-the-shelf tools to create my own character for my independent work is that a lot of the shading that was designed for skin was based on the assumption that you were creating a Caucasian character. And if you wanted to create darker skin, you had to do things like tint shader on top, like the base texture on top, which was like, that's not the right way to create detail in skin shading. You actually lose detail that way. So as I started digging into this, I became aware of some other people doing research in this area. And there's in particular, Professor Ted Theodore Kim at Yale. He's a computer scientist who also used to work at Pixar doing research, and he has focused on this area as well. And he's especially interested in hair shading. And so what we know about hair is there's 4 types of hair. They get categorized from 1 to 4, 1 being perfectly straight and 4 being kinky hair, which is the kind of hair that you would need to simulate in order to represent black hair. And there's not a lot of research that's been done on this hair. And what we also know is when we look at skin shading, it also goes from this type 1, 2, 3. And so there's like, first off, a hierarchy by number that's happening in both cases. And then all of the research in terms of like the papers that are published are based on white skin shading. And if you go into a Google search, like just do a Google search for skin shader, you'll get page after page of formulas and images that show you how to make like realistic skin for white skin. So we think that this is a problem, and it is easily addressed, but first we have to make other people aware of it, and then we need to do research to counter it by doing research on skin and hair that uses actual models of people of color and Black people and people who have type 4 kinky hair. So that's like the basis of that particular research platform. And just this week, we've had some really great presentations that we've participated in at CGRAPH, which is a computer graphics conference. And I can actually link you to a talk that Professor Kim did about the history of
Oh
skin and
yeah, I would
hair
love to
shading
include
issue.
that in the show notes so if people want to look
Yeah.
and check it out. Yeah, I just because you're saying this, it just reminds me of when I was in undergrad and we would get some of those assignments, right, where you're doing your skin shader, you're basically like making yourself, and it's like here's all the steps. But I would do it and I would always kind of like have to figure out how to get mine to like not look ashy, and the hair thing, you just couldn't make it work. And it was like, again, like you saying, all the steps was under the assumption that it's a Caucasian person that you're making, and I would do the same tensing and like just trying to get the brown to work, but like I have undertones, and it's just like I just I don't know. I can't get this to work. My professors can't really like help me, and
Yeah.
mine looks different from like the rest of my classmates. And then the hair, like I remember my thesis character, I was like, the easiest thing for me to do was just to like use spheres and try and just like emulate like Afro textured hair with spheres, because I'm not about to figure out how to texture and get something in like a sim hair. But that also, like, I remember once in grad school, I mean, not grad school, in undergrad, and paying more attention to, like, the features that were coming out, I'd be like, how come we can get all these creatures, but we just can't get brown and black people or characters on screen, but we can have, like, characters and creatures with different, like, fur textures or whatever. I would think of, like, Brave, and they were so impressed with her hair system, and I was like, I don't understand why that can't translate to like a character, like we're saying, with kinky hair. When you have it working right here, but I don't know. And then we could have blue characters and green characters, but it's getting brown characters is just too tricky. I just like I don't know, but okay.
It's not tricky. It's just a question of focus, right? So like the research isn't there, and then also the people driving the research are not, who would be driving the research, the right people are not in the room. And so we do know that like there's an archetype of the kind of person that does this research. And when I look at like technical art, for example, and you go online and you see all the people that are doing tutorials and showing their work, there's a lot of white men doing this work, and there's not a lot of Black female technical artists. There are some, but there's not as many, and
Right.
they're not vocal, right? So we don't see them online. And so I think we need more researchers, more technical artists who embody this perspective to be in the room doing the research and talking about it.
I see. So I want to pivot and talk about the film that you co-directed. It's Minimum Mass, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I just feel like I'm not saying words correctly. I don't know why I'm second guessing myself.
you are.
But yes, tell the viewers and listeners about that film. Why did you go off on that venture to do a personal project and more?
Yeah. So, there was one summer that my partner and I were just writing a bunch of scripts, and it was kind of like our hobby. Like we said, let's just write a bunch of scripts and then start putting some of them into production. He also works in visual effects, or did, and he's a researcher now. So we wrote a bunch of short scripts, and we were also trying to conceive our son, and we were experiencing a series of miscarriages. And so we wrote about that because, as an artist, that's what artists do, is we take our own experiences and we try to make sense of them in some kind of narrative way. And then that project, we ended up submitting it to the Sundance New Frontier Lab, and it got traction. And so we went there and we developed it, and then we got more funding through the New Zealand Film Commission, and it became a thing. And we decided to tell this particular story as a virtual reality experience. So it's about a couple who experience a series of miscarriages and come to believe their children are being born in another dimension. And the idea is that it's a real thing that happened to us, but we wanted to explore the story through the context of like speculative science fiction, because from a filmmaking perspective, that's where we come from. And we also felt like it's this really dark matter, at that time, and things have actually really changed a lot in the last 3 years in terms of the popular culture discourse around miscarriage. But at that time, not a lot of people were talking about it. And we thought, let's try and use genre to tell this story in a way that's more accessible. And so, yeah, that's why we wrote the story, and that's how we started working on it. And also, we just were like, as visual effects artists, a lot of people were starting to talk about VR and some of these technologies, and we thought, let's investigate this new medium and see what it's about.
And how was the VR experience for you as a creator as well?
It was not easy. It was like VR is we call it a stubborn medium because there's just so much friction in the pipeline right now. Like there's a lot of moving parts, there's like computer graphics component, there's real time, and we decided we're going to do an Unreal Engine. And there's like everything you need to know to do animation, which is a lot, right? Like with motion capture, cleaning up motion capture, character design, all that other stuff. And then user experience, prototyping, everything. So, but because I think one of the things that visual effects artists tend to be good at is the ability to work through technical problems, because that's our job. That's what we do, is we solve technical problems in the service of making visual narratives. And so we have this high tolerance for tools that don't work or are proving very challenging.
That's just so true.
That's
high tolerance for things that don't work is just so true about working in this entertainment industry, like on the computer side.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're a 3D artist, you have a very high tolerance for debugging and things that don't work. So I think like with that perspective in mind, we were able to sort of just like brute force our way into learning all of these different technologies. In particular, like what is real time? How do you work in Unreal Engine, and how do you shape your vision to conform to this particular resource footprint, which is real time and also stereo rendering for the headset. So it was hard, but it was kind of fun actually.
Yeah, and I know like we use a bit of VR on my production, and I was just wondering too, did you have any like in the beginning, your body have any reactions to being in the VR headset? Like, did you have like motion sickness, like headaches and anything like that? Because it's one thing to like play a game, I feel like, and like, I don't know, watch a short film, but to be in there creating stuff, it seems like some of our artists really have to ramp up to spending time in there.
Yeah, so our setup was that we had a headset, like a Oculus Rift, at each person's workstation, and then so you constantly had to be putting the headset on to, see what's happening in the headset. But I'm not working in the headset all the time because that's too much. Like I'm just working with 2 monitors. But our user experience for minimum mass is that it's a diorama. So it's like third person and it's diorama scale. It's not room scale. And so the idea is that you have this environment, which could be a house or like a chunk of terrain that's like broken off a landmass, and you hold it in your hand and the little characters are moving around in there like a play, and you can manipulate it. So you could lean in, you could translate up and down and rotate it. But the original user experience also included scaling. So you would use your controllers in both hands to like pull the world apart, and it would get bigger and then it would get smaller. And that was something that we, the developers who were working on it, were like really into. We loved this idea. And then every time we showed it to someone, put a non-developer in the headset, they were like, this is really disorienting. And I think it has to do with that tolerance level. And, John Carmack has said that there's this whole, and a bunch of other researchers have said this, is that like the virtual experience needs to like actually mimic the physical experience. If you're doing something to someone's body in the virtual space that totally departs from the sense of reality and physics of the real world, that's when you introduce nausea. And in this case, it was like you're scaling the world and the horizon was shifting, which like causes this nauseous feeling to happen. And so we eventually accepted that this was a cool user experience, but not a good one. And so we got rid of that. We got rid of the
Okay.
scaling factor and instead made it that your body, if you physically move close to this environment, you scale it up. And if you physically move away, kind of like in the real world, and then everything really started to fall into place after we streamlined that.
I tell you, this VR experience is just, it's so interesting. So I think it was like in 2019, I went to this place called VR Bar that's here in Brooklyn. It's in like Dumbo, Brooklyn. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like exactly what it sounds like. There's like a little bar and like, you know, you can get cocktails or whatever. But there's a whole bunch of stations where you can have different, I know, VR
Drinking and
experiences.
VR. No.
Exactly. So I think I got called to come in because they were filming something for like, I don't know, the news or whatever, entertainment thing. And I'm doing one where it's like you're in, I don't know why, but you start off kind of in an elevator and the elevator opens and there's like a plank. I think it's probably called plank or something. And then you
I've
walk
done
out
that
on the,
one.
oh, you have, yeah. So
It's
for
scary.
listeners, it is because you walk out on the plank and then you realize you're so like high up in a building, and I felt my knees like buckle, and then I was like, I'm starting to crouch down, and I'm like, this is so embarrassing because I know essentially like I'm in like a lounge, like, you know, and I was like, anybody else who's like outside and around me is probably like, oh, she's playing that game, but I was like, I physically cannot even take another step because the VR experience can be so immersive in that way. It's pretty
I've never been
crazy.
able to get out of the elevator. So
Oh,
there are
really?
some people that just jump out because they don't flip out about it, but I can't do it.
Oh,
I
that's
have
so
a fear
funny.
of heights in general.
Okay, so that makes some sense.
It's very effective.
It is. I don't think I really have a fear of heights, but I could just do about like I could not get to the end of the board. That's yeah.
Yeah.
I would have been on the ground literally trying to do that. But I could understand how like the whole zooming in and out thing could make people sick, but I haven't had any nauseous type of thing just yet. But before we move on to the second part of the show, could you tell us a little bit of what you're currently working on? Any sort of side projects, personal projects?
Yeah, so I'm working on another VR experience, which is about my father and my relationship with my father. And sort of, so my father died in 2001, and I am thinking the experience, like designing the experience like a digital resurrection of
Oh
him.
wow.
And yeah, exploration of memories of my childhood and then memories of his childhood. And so I think of it as like a post colonial ghost story because it's about understanding generations of the post colonial experience and hauntings that have happened in my family, like through my father and his mother and their ancestors. So it's a little bit heavy, but that's the idea.
Wow, that is heavy. I already feel like I'm probably gonna get emotional. I too lost my father, so I'm gonna check it out
Yeah,
when it's out in the world. But I will brace myself. Like,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah. So we're gonna move on to the second part, which is lighter, and we're gonna talk about some of your favorite animated films and TV shows, starting with Spirited Away. I don't think we've had anyone. I could be lying. Just in case we haven't had anyone talk about the movie yet, can you just, real simply recap the movie?
So Spirited Away is a Miyazaki film. It's a Japanese animated film from 2006. Is it? No, 2001. And it's about a little girl who's like on the cusp of growing up. And it's kind of an exploration of the loss of her childhood, the beauty of like being in the secret world, the secret fantasy world of childhood, and the darkness that exists in that fantasy world. And then she like is about to become of school age or something, and she goes into this secret place and has all these adventures, and it's very fantastic, but also dark. And then she emerges on the other side of it, like wiser and ready to move on to the next phase of her life. I think that's what I would describe it being
And
about.
why is it one of your favorites?
Because it does this like really beautiful thing that I think the best animated films do, which is explore the unconscious of, or the subconscious of a character. And so it's this girl that's like struggling with being on the cusp of like adulthood or young adulthood. And so she has all these like feelings inside about it. And the way that it manifests itself is through these magical and frightening characters of like giant babies and witches and baba yagas and ghosts that come to life, and it's all about like her shadow self, the things that she's scared of. And so it's like deeply psychological, and then it's also very psychedelic. Like crazy
Mm-hmm.
things are happening in this world, you know, inanimate objects are coming to life, and that's what animation also does, is it like breathes life into things that are inanimate. And I just think that this film does all of these things so well. And it also is very dark, which I
Yes.
think the best fairy tales are. And so it's that like balance of darkness and lightness, and how children are really good at negotiating these two things.
Now, people should know that I am a scaredy cat. I get scared very easily about almost everything. So when this first came out, I thought it was actually a scary movie. So I didn't see it until I was like in my late teens at that
Yeah. I
time.
mean, it kind of is.
Yeah, because I saw like the no face character and like all the. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what y'all talking about, trying to get me to watch this stuff. Like, I'll pass. Do you have a favorite moment from that movie?
A favorite moment? Like, isn't there that moment where they're like outside at that restaurant and they're eating, and then people start to like overeat and kind of engorge themselves, and it all becomes like kind of grotesque and
Yep.
frightening, and I just love that part.
I was thinking about that too because I remember being like, the food looks so good. Like, this is some of the best cartoon food I've ever seen, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
And
yeah.
if you have seen the movie Over the Moon, I actually think it's quite comparable, except Over the Moon is
Mm,
CG. But I think Over the Moon is a good contender for like best animated food ever.
okay.
And
Yeah,
I
animated
won't say
food
too
that
much.
like 1 minute looks delicious and in another minute is like totally grotesque.
Yeah.
That's the specialness of Spirited Away.
Well, yes, yeah, that's true too. Another movie you mentioned was The Animatrix, which is one that I do remember, but I actually haven't seen. Can you, yeah,
Yeah,
recap it for us?
so that was like the Wachowskis doing the, you know, they were one of the first Western filmmakers to really explore the transmedia. Sort of like it had been done in Japan a lot, this idea that you would break off a part of your story and put it into another medium and then access a whole other audience that way. And so the Animatrix is like a series of, it's an anthology of short animated films which come from the world of the Matrix, but are being told by different, directed by different people. So they have different styles. And yeah, it's just like it's, you know, I just think the world of the Matrix is fascinating, and it just explores different aspects of that, including the I think there's like a Ghost in the Shell short in there as well,
Oh,
which is quite interesting.
cool. So I
And
think,
there's like a haunted house one, and they're like, you know, Anna, I guess anime and Western mashup interpretations of classic myths as well. So it's just like a whole lot of cool stuff happening.
yeah, I looked at, I was just scrolling through, so I saw some of the images for it, but I believe it's on HBO Max. So it's, if you have a subscription, you should be able to see it. If not, you'll pay your $2, $3 somewhere else and see it. What did I want to say about? Oh, because you said that how you take like a piece of the story and you break it out and put it into another medium. What I will be talking about on my podcast too now is the Marvel's What If. So when you said that, like, I was like, oh, that's exactly what they're doing with that, because they're taking
Mm.
their, well, what was once the comic books, and then it's live action. Now they're taking the live action and exploring other avenues with this animated medium. So that's in some upcoming episodes for listeners. But it's nice to hear you say, well, this was something that was being done before then that I personally wasn't aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Marvel has put all of this transmedia stuff into hyperdrive now. but
Oh, absolutely.
it's been around. Yeah.
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 I think in some ways, unfortunately, what's happening is everything is starting to be compared or fold back into like Marvel, or like we are having Marvel expectations for other stuff, and it's like no, like like Marvel's doing what they're doing, and that's fine and dandy, and other people can do what they're doing without it having to be necessarily right or wrong, or unfortunately always comparable to Marvel. Like, I'm going off on a
Yeah.
tangent, but there's 2 Suicide Squad movies, and I was like, why? And like, I was joking with my friend. I was like, are they creating a multiverse of movies here? Like, does this tie into like anything? And my friend was like, Malik, it's not Marvel. It's like, even if it's not Marvel, is this just like 2 origin stories? Like, why is there 2? Is it an actual sequel? Is it not a sequel? Is it like a 0.5? I haven't seen
Well,
any of
I
them,
mean,
so I'm not sure.
I think my frustration with the Marvel stuff is that people who aren't doing Marvel are actually not free to not do Marvel, because it has fundamentally changed the industry so much that we don't know how to, or we don't have an audience. We've kind of decimated the audience and the infrastructure to create mid-budget and even small budget films, right? So now we have the monoculture, and there's very little else left. And there's a lot of people who have written about why this has happened and why the studios allowed it to happen. But it is a system that we have now, and so we don't really get that variety of films that we used to see. And the death of the
Yeah.
film industry is a whole nother topic.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep going off on this tangent. I've talked about that with my friends in terms of like the whole like B list and C list movies, like how we used to just get bad movies, but they were like fun, and that was like kind of okay. Like you can just take those risks, and now like everything has to like be a big blockbuster budget thing. It has to have like celebrities, and like I'm a real sucker for like some good corny romance comedies,
Mm,
and I feel like I find myself really watching the same things over and over because the new ones just they feel so off,
mm.
and yeah, so like there isn't really a space to like be those B and C list movies and still have a good time with that because everything's trying to be super perfect. But yes, moving on to another movie that you shared. I don't know, Persepolis? Persepolis?
Oh yeah,
Persepolis?
Persepolis.
Okay.
Have you seen
What is
this?
that? No.
It's a really beautiful film. So it Persepolis started off as a graphic novel, and it's by an Irani female director, and I don't know the name her name off the top of my head, but she wrote this graphic novel as a memoir of her experience growing up in Iran, in the time like before, during the Shah, the fall of the Shah. And then she turned it into a feature animated film, which is
Mm.
also very beautiful. And both things work really well. So I guess it's a kind of transmedia, except that she's the common denominator and she's this independent creative force that made it happen. And so it's a 2D feature animated film, and it's very much this like um, consciousness and perspective of this young woman, her relationship with her sisters, her relationship to popular culture. It's really playful, and it's this docu memoir kind of
Mm.
genre that I'm really interested in. Is how do you use the material of your real life and real true stories to then create sort of like imaginative genre interpretations, and also like the memoir experience of like
I'm gonna have to
your
check that out.
yeah, it's from 2007. And it's really good.
Yeah, because I'm doing a personal project that I think I could definitely get some inspiration from because I'm calling it like, I don't know what the word is, but it's like a documentary. It's just an animated documentary. So I'm gravitating to a lot of things that just are right up that alley, it sounds like. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to shows. You shared something that begins with an R. Like Rilakuma,
Oh, Rilakuma and Koru.
Rilakuma, and Koru. Okay, there's a lot of syllables there. That's on Netflix. I saw it. I added it to my list. But can you tell just like a little overview of what the show is about, and if you have like a favorite episode or a favorite moment?
I guess it's very much in the vein of the Spirited Away kind of storytelling. It's Japanese, but in this case, it's a stop motion puppet animated series. And it's again that exploration of like a young woman's imaginary life. So it's this young woman who has this kind of dreary uh, day job as a secretary, and she has all of these like animals that are like her children that live at home, and they're just stuffed animals that come to life. And so in the beginning of the show, you're like, is this real? Is this not? The show doesn't care if it's real or if it's not. You just accept it. And it's kind of about her existential, concerns. Like she's lonely, she's looking for love, she has to take care of these like little children who are her stuffed animals. It's just like, it's super cute. It's that fine line between cute and whimsical and fantasy, and also the dark reality of loneliness and existence, which I guess is kind of my jam. So
I love doing this with guests because we start seeing a theme, like once you start talking about what you picked and why you picked it, you're like, I'm learning a lot about myself right now.
It's just the same story that I keep watching over and over again.
and I'm totally here for that because I find myself gravitating to like the same kind of like a girl character that's like in her head a lot, and then it's just like what she imagines versus what she's actually experiencing, and it would be like, and sometimes the most interesting type of media, because I also love like Spirited Away and like Kiki's Delivery Service, but I also really love Bob's Burgers, and I'm starting to accept that I probably gravitate to Tina a lot. And I'm just like, what does that say about me? But like I'm right there with Tina, like, and she has all these fantasies in her head, and then whatever she actually says or experiences in real life, it's like, Tina, get it on the same page. So I feel you. You have this other show that's also on my list called Beastars.
Oh my gosh. Do you want to talk about Beastars? Because like I don't know anyone that wants to talk about Beastars. But
I don't know anything really about
like
it. Okay, yeah, but it's on my list, but I haven't gotten around because I'm not too sure. I feel like I've seen questionable things about Twitter about it, and I'm like, should I just go forth and watch it, or should I not watch it?
I think you should go forth and watch it. It's super weird. So it's also this other genre that I like, which is like, it's the teen melodrama, but weird, right? So like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And it's basically a teen melodrama, but then it has these layers of other things that it's exploring. So it's like omnivores versus carnivores. And so all the characters are animals, and half of them are omnivores and half of them are carnivores. And so there's this like whole paradigm of like power and how it's enacted in society, who like literally who eats who. And then there's like this kind of layer of sexuality because it's a teen melodrama, and some of the omnivores are secretly attracted to the carnivores. And it's just really weird, but the animation is very beautiful, and it's kind of this interesting mashup of tones. So it's like speculative and weird, but then it's also very realistic because it's just the melodrama of human existence, particularly young people. And so it's kind of like why I love Fantastic Mr. Fox, for example. Like I like highly anthropomorphized, realistic animal stuff where it's almost just like talking heads, but it happens to be animals.
Yeah. So there's that one show too with like, even though it's really cutesy, it's, I don't know, what is she? Is she like a red panda or something, and she works in an office?
Okay.
Do you know? I can't. I have to figure that out. I'm probably gonna have to send it to you after. But I just remember seeing a clip where she went to do like karaoke with her coworkers, and everybody's animals. It's really cutesy stuff, almost like Hello Kitty cutesy. But then the karaoke song is like heavy metal, and it was just
something like is it a Gretsu?
Oh, maybe.
Gretsu? Yeah. Someone told me I should watch that.
Yeah, it seems it's cutesy, but I heard like it's actually really funny, and I feel like it's in the vein of all this stuff. But that clip, I just found it to be like hysterical because it's like I wasn't ready. Again, it's like Hello Kitty cutesy stuff, but she's like insane.
Yeah, she reaches out a lot.
Yeah. So the last show that you shared was Seis Manos.
Yeah, that's also on Netflix, and it's kind of this current resurgence of Western anime. So like
Mm-hmm.
taking the anime genre and reinterpreting it across different cultures. And so Seis Manos is kind of like an exploitation Mexican Western about these siblings who were orphaned and then have to seek revenge and uncover their backstory. And it's all animated, and it's just like cool and weird.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've added
it's
all of
good.
these to my list.
It kind of feels like it could have been made by Tarantino, but it has other concerns. Like it's more about like family melodrama. So that's what I like about it.
Cool, cool. So we are gonna start winding down, and I gave you two questions ahead of time. This is the time. Which animated character, just in all the whole universe, would you say you're most like, and why?
Okay, so I want to say that I am like Bugs Bunny because the thing about Bugs Bunny is that he never loses his cool, right? He's just
Hmm.
like he's kind of very authentic. He's who he is, but then he also happens to be cool and right. Things always work out for him. So I want to be Bugs Bunny, but in reality, I'm probably Wile E. Coyote, like trying to be cool, trying to do elaborate things that will have a certain outcome, and then it always backfires, and like you're just left looking at Bugs Bunny and being angry about why he gets to always be so cool and you're not. But like my heart really always went out to Wile E. Coyote. Like I wanted just once things to
Yeah.
work out for him.
Yeah.
Because
Absolutely.
he's very creative. Like he has these super creative ways of laying traps and making things happen. You're just like, surely it should work out for you one of these times. So my
Yeah.
heart
I
really was always with him.
He doesn't get credit for how creative he is. Actually,
Yeah.
that's a good
I think
point.
maybe in a DEI world, like Wiley would get more credit for just trying so hard and
Yeah.
showing up
Right.
and having legitimate skills, but somehow not being set up for success.
Yeah, and I think that's also a good point you made about Bugs Bunny like never losing his cool. It's like I didn't realize that
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, well, he's sort of this archetype that you see, like he's like Captain Picard in a way, right? Like Captain Picard almost never loses his cool. Like that, I think, is what we admire about a heroic character. Is they're very
Yeah,
dispassionate.
so unrealistic.
I know.
And if you were to cast your family, which in a biopic, which characters would you use? And we can keep it up to like three family members. Nothing too tricky or complicated.
I kind of struggled with this one because I don't know. Like I think this is part of my journey in animation is that I've never really seen my world depicted or
Mm-hmm.
like my life experience depicted in the animated world. Like there are things that I identify with and characters that I love, but in terms of like family, and that's some I think that's the reason why I'm trying to make this next project as like a docu memoir about my family, because I want to know like what would it be like to put my family in a story world that's animated. And it hasn't happened yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're not the first person to say that, and you might not be the last either. But that actually brings me back to a question I wanted to ask and I forgot it, and that was just like, what role or how does your culture and your background come into play, or how has it come into play with your creative journey?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of hasn't, and it hasn't in that my parents, when I was younger, they wanted me to be a doctor and go to med school and do traditional things like that. And my father was an engineer, and so like, if you're a young Pakistani kid back in the day, you either became an engineer or a physician, and those were the acceptable outcomes. And anything in the middle was like kind of frowned upon. And so my family has always been supportive, but I don't think they've ever. My parents never really understood what it was about. Like, oh, this is a interesting thing for you to be doing, but increasingly I appreciate that they didn't prevent me from doing it. Even if they didn't understand it, they never got in the way, which I think I've seen a lot of young people, and I still see it in my job now, is that they have these family pressures and they can't flourish creatively because they're being pressured to do something else. And the writer Viet Nguyen actually wrote a New York Times essay about this recently, like what it means to be a young Asian person and unsupported by your family if you're trying to become an artist. So I think that that's sort of my job, is like with my son and my nieces and nephews, is like I want them to feel like, okay, you have a voice and something to say as a person of color and an Asian person, and your family supports you to do that. It's not even that the forces are against you, but that you are allowed to do whatever you want
Yes.
outside the context of these traditional jobs with capital J's. Yeah.
No,
So I have a very supportive family, but I think that they never really understood until more recently, like what I was actually trying to do, because it was so out of context for a Pakistani person.
like I get it. I understand. Can you, first off, that was actually a really good note to, I guess, close out on. And I want to say thank you for taking your time out of your day to join me and share like your background and your journey and your favorite stuff to watch with us. Can you tell my listeners and viewers how they can check out your stuff, if you have a website, if you're open to engaging on social media, maybe share your handles?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Hydrox and Horlicks on Twitter, at Hydrox and Horlicks, and we can spell that for you in the show notes. That's how I
Yes.
met you, Monique, is I think we just started chatting on Twitter because I was really intrigued and appreciative of what you're doing with your other program called Diverse Tunes.
Thank you.
So you can find me there. You can also find me at hydroxandhorlick.com or minimummass.com if you want to learn more about Minimum Mass, the VR experience, and where it might be playing at a festival near you. Yeah,
Yes.
that's
Okay. Keep it
I'm
cute
easy to
and
find.
simple. Yeah, and I will have links as we said to everything in the show notes. You are going to send me that talk, and that will be in the show notes as well. Thank you again. Thank you everybody for listening, tuning, and sharing and supporting. And until next time, bye.